Good evening, and welcome to another night of reading Sister Carrie. I was fortunate enough to catch Frederick Knutson's stream today. I don't do too much Twitch, so I have to write down when certain people are streaming who I want to watch. Let me get the chat going so I can see what's going on. There we are. Whoops. Is there anybody in here? Okay. How's our sound going? There we are. Oops. Is there anybody in here? Okay. How's our sound going? Okay. There was a long enough silence for me to hear the stream after the delay. So we'll get right into it. I have to congratulate Frederick Knutson for streaming for almost 5 hours with no real plan. He's like Bill Burr in a way, able to keep the conversation going with just himself, although maybe he had a guest on in the beginning. So, Carrie, our protagonist, our heroine, just finished her first day of work in a shoe factory after she moved to Chicago to live with her sister and her sister's husband, and she found her first day of work to be horrific. And the entire previous chapter, we're about to start chapter 5, the entire chapter 4 was just about the sights and sounds of being in, honestly, a sweatshop in 1889 in Chicago. So, hello, it's the Costanza, John's Woods, Curtis Lumber, George Rumsey, Curtis Lumber again, Diane Castor, and George Rumsey. So there is a scant 15 people in here tonight to hear the story. I'll be honest, I'm jealous of Fred's streams, which are usually 500 people. But it's not healthy to compare yourself to others. Chapter 5. Drouet did not call that evening. That worthy, after receiving the letter, had laid aside all thought of Carrie for the time being and was floating around having what he considered a gay time. I love the use of the word gay. Remember, this book was published in 1900, right on the money. Drouet, if you remember, was the kind of pimpy douchebag that Carrie met on the train to Chicago. So now we're going to spend a little bit of time with Drouet and what this numbnuts was doing while Carrie was experiencing firsthand what working in a sweatshop is like. On this particular evening, he dined at Retter's, a restaurant of some local fame, which occupied a basement at Clark and Monroe Streets. Thereafter, he visited the resort of Hannah and Hoggs, which was in the Adams Streets opposite the somewhat imposing Federal Building. So this may be a real place. It may have been in 1889, because we just referenced the Federal Building in Chicago. I don't know where that is, but apparently this resort is just across the street. And remember, Theodore Dreiser is using the vernacular of the time. We would consider what he's calling a resort, we would consider a full-service nightclub. Possibly have some rooms aside for if you need a room, a bedroom, private lounges, multiple places, multiple bars, multiple floors. Think Studio 54, although Studio 54 was built into a theater. Hannah and Hogs would be more like a distinguished smoking social club, although much, much larger. So he's at this, what we would consider a fancy club. There he leaned over the splendid bar, which it contained and swallowed. He leaned over the splendid bar, which it contained, and swallowed a glass of plain whiskey and purchased a couple of cigars, one of which he lighted. This to him represented in part high life, a fair sample of what the whole must be. Drouet was not a drinker, in the sense that the term is used to express excess. He was not a moneyed man. He only craved the best as his mind conceived it. And such doings seemed to him to be part of the best. Rutgers, with its polished marble walls and floor, its profusion of lights, its show of china and silverware, and above all its reputation as a resort for actors and professional men, seemed to him to be the proper place for a successful man to go. He loved fine clothes, good eating, and particularly the company and acquaintanceships of successful men. When dining, it was a source of keen satisfaction to him to know that Joseph Jefferson was wont to come into this place, to this same place at some time or another, or that Henry E. Dixie, quite a well-known performer of the day, was there only a few tables off. At Rutgers, he could always obtain the satisfaction, for there, particularly of an evening, one could encounter politicians, brokers, actors, some rich young rounders of the town, all eating and drinking amid a buzz of popular commonplace conversation. "That's so-and-so over there," was a common remark of those gentlemen among themselves, particularly among those who had not yet reached but hoped to do so. The dazzling height which money to dine here lavishly represented. And I can sympathize with this, because one of my favorite places to eat so far in the world, Seaside Cabaret in Lower Hutt, New Zealand, obviously is number one, but Malibu Kitchen in Malibu, California, north of LA. That's up there. The burritos are good. The price is reasonable. But that's a place for car watching. Jerry Seinfeld may show up. Jay Leno may show up. You don't know what you're going to see there, to the point that people in the know, and that place, unfortunately, is closing. The owner, Bill, was not given the opportunity to renew his lease on this store, so he's moving to the Malibu Farmers Market, but the transition may take a year for him to obtain a new place. So Malibu Kitchen, the people in car circles simply call it Bill's. You don't say Malibu Kitchen, you say I'm going to Bill's, to sort of hide the fact that this is the car spot for interesting things in the Los Angeles area. I could probably get a very good burrito elsewhere, but I will take that $55 Lyft ride from the Hilton Hotel in West LA all the way out there just to have a sandwich, because who knows what you might see or who you might see. Check the chat. This is my first time something. Good evening. Vibes are good. This is my first time doing this. What do I do? Says Paul Cram. You don't do anything. I'm just reading I'm just reading you a bedtime story, and I'm remarking about different things as we read this book. So we're reading a novel, which I will work my way through throughout these videos, and I will comment on certain things as we do it. Once again, this is Sister Carrie, written or published in the year 1900, and the story is taking place in 1889 in Chicago. Currently, we're following a character named Drouet, whose opinions, well, let's go back to him. "You don't say so," would be the reply. "Why, yes, don't you know that? Why, he's the manager of the Grand Opera House." When these things would fall upon Drouet's ears, he would straighten himself a little bit more stiffly and eat with solid comfort. If he had any vanity, this augmented it. As if he had any ambition, and if he had any ambition, this stirred it. He would be able to flash a roll of greenbacks too some day. As it was, he could eat where they did. His preference for Hannah and Hogg's Adam Street place was another yard off the same cloth. This was really a gorgeous saloon from a Chicago standpoint. Like Rector's, it was also ornamented with a blaze of incandescent lights, held handsome chandeliers set in graceful places. The floors were of brightly colored tiles. The walls were a composition of rich, dark polished wood which reflected the light, and colored stucco work which gave the place a very sumptuous appearance. The long bar was a blaze of lights, polished woodwork, colored and cut glassware with many fancy bottles. It was a truly swell saloon, with rich screens, fancy wines, and a line of bar goods unsurpassed in the country. At Rector's, Drouet had met Mr. G.W. Hurstwood, the manager of Hannah and Hogg's Adam Street place, the latter having been pointed out as a very successful and well-known man about town. Hurstwood looked the part, for besides being slightly under 40, he had a good stout constitution, an active manner, and a solid substantial air, which was composed in part of his fine clothes, his clean linen, his jewels, and above all his own sense of his importance. Drouet immediately conceived a notion of him as being someone worth knowing, and was glad not only to meet him, but to visit the Adam Street bar thereafter whenever he wanted a drink or a cigar. So this Hurstwood character, who will become another central character in this story, was the manager of Hannah and Hogg's, this fabulous, at what we would consider today, a nightclub. So imagine you're the manager of something like a Studio 54, or, I don't really go out much. Name your favorite big-time place where everybody goes. Everybody who's anybody goes to this club. The manager there is a celebrity unto themselves. Only online, no same screen, something. Did you get dandruff? How cold is your house, Brian? Very cold. My house is not very comfortable in the wintertime. I don't see myself living here forever. It's a very affordable place to rent. I don't own it. And of course, Greg International owns this place. He's giving me flying lessons for free. We hang out from time to time, and he's a very kind landlord. He ought to be. We went to school together. So, but this house is built in 1877, and so it's older than this book. And it's plaster and lath, and while it is drafty and cold in the wintertime, it's quite nice in the summertime. These high ceilings, it's breezy. I only need to turn there's window units. I only need to turn one window unit on for maybe an hour or so to cool down my bedroom to sleep in the summertime, and then I turn it off. So that's the trade-off. Hertzwood was an interesting character after his kind. He was shrewd and clever, and in many little things capable of creating a good impression. His position, which was fairly important, was that of manager, a kind of stewardship, which was imposing but lacked financial control. He had risen by perseverance and industry, through long years of service from the position of a bartender, in a commonplace saloon to his present altitude. He had a little office in the place, set off in polished cherry and grill work, where he kept in a roll-top desk a rather simple accounts of the place, supplies ordered and needed, and so on. The chief executive and financial functions devolved upon the owners. And here's an abbreviation: Messrs. Hannah and Hogg, and upon a cashier who looked after the money taken in. For the most part, he lounged about, dressed in excellent tailored suits of imported goods, several rings upon his fingers, a fine blue diamond in his necktie, a striking vest of some new pattern, and a watch chain of solid gold, which he held in the charm of a rich design, and a watch of the latest make and engraving. He knew by name and could greet personally with a, "Well, old fellow," hundreds of actors, merchants, politicians, and the general run of successful characters about town. And it was a part of his success to do so. He had a finely graduated scale of informality and friendship, which improved from the "How do you do?" addressed to the $15 a week clients, and office attachés who, by long frequenting the place, became aware of his position, to "Why, old man, how are you?" which he addressed to those noted or rich individuals who knew him and were inclined to be friendly. There was a class, however, too rich, too famous, or too successful, with whom he could not attempt any familiarity or of address, and with these he was professionally tactful, assuming a grave and dignified attitude, paying them the deference which would win their good feeling without in the least compromising his own bearing or opinions. There were, in the last place, a few good followers, neither rich nor poor, famous, not yet remarkably successful, with whom he was friendly on the score of good fellowship. These were the kind of men whom he would converse with the longest and perhaps the most seriously. So and this is true today, part of any good manager of a nightclub or a social club or any sort of like hospitality is to be friendly with the patrons and, talk in a familiar way and greet them, shake hands, that sort of thing. Make them feel welcome. And where is my water? Remember, this guy's managing a hugely successful nightclub, and he isn't even 40 yet. Let's call him like 35, which would make Drouet the kind of lovable douchebag, maybe 25. Hertzwood loved to go out and have a good time once in a while, go to the races, the theaters, the sporting entertainments at some of the clubs, and those more unmentionable resorts of vice, which means a whorehouse. So this guy whores around. We'll find out later that he's married. Isn't that such a nice phrase? The sporting entertainments at some of the clubs and those more unmentionable resorts of vice. The gilded this is good. The gilded chambers of shame, with which Chicago was then so liberally cursed. He kept a horse and a neat trap, had a wife, 2 children who were well established in a neat house on the north side near Lincoln Park, and was altogether a very acceptable individual of our great American upper class, the first grade below the luxuriously rich. Hertzwood liked Drouet. The latter's genteel nature and dressy appearance pleased him. He knew that Drouet was only a traveling salesman, and not one of many years standing at that, but the firm Barlett, Crayot and Company was a large and prosperous house, and Drouet stood well. Hertzwood knew that Crayot was quite well, having drunk a glass now and then with him, in company with several others when the conversation was general. Drouet had what was a help in his business, a moderate sense of humor, and could tell a good story when the occasion required. He could talk races with Hertzwood, tell interesting incidents concerning himself and his expertise with women, and report the state of trade in cities which he visited, and so managed to make himself almost invariably agreeable. So that's Theodore Dreiser's way of saying, this guy, Drouet, just knows how to say the right words to be nice and be liked, and there's nothing very remarkable about him. He's the type of guy who never talks politics. He's a walking NPC. He just happens to have a little bit of money and dresses as if he does, which he is. Haha, for real, turn up the heat. That's pretty damn cool. Did Pennsylvania Houses something? Recommend a book, Gentleman in Moscow. Truly book. Why are so few people watching this masterpiece? Well, joke's on them then. Maybe we'll be vindicated eventually when they realize someone is reading an entire novel to you every night. Tonight, Drouet was particularly so, since his report to the company had been favorably commented upon, his new samples had been satisfactorily selected, and his trip marked out for his next 6 weeks. "Why, hello, Charlie, old man," said Hertzwood, as Drouet came in that evening at 8 o'clock. "How goes it?" The room was crowded. Drouet shook hands, beaming good nature, and they strolled toward the bar. "Oh, all right. I haven't seen you in 6 weeks. When did you get in?" "Friday," said Drouet. "Had a fine trip." "Glad of it," said Hertzwood, his black eyes lit with warmth which was half displaced by the cold make-believe that usually dwelt in them. I'm going to read that again. His black eyes lit with warmth which half displaced the cold make-believe that usually dwelt with him. So Hertzwood is he is accustomed to being fake nice to everybody. "What are you going to take?" he added, as the barkeeper in a snowy jacket and tie leaned forward toward them from behind the bar. "Hennessy," said Drouet. "A little of the same for me," put in Hertzwood. "How long are you in town this time?" inquired Hertzwood. Only till Wednesday. Going up to St. Paul." "George Evans was in here Saturday, said he saw you in Milwaukee last week." "Yes, I know George," returned Drouet. "Great old boy, isn't he? We had quite a time there together." The barkeeper was setting out the glasses and bottle before them, and they now poured out the draught as they talked. Drouet filling his to within a third of a glass full, as was considered proper, and Hertzwood taking the barest suggestion of whiskey and modifying it with seltzer. So, Drouet pours the correct amount of Hennessy, a third of the way up, which is about 2 fingers in the glass. And Hertzwood, why they call Hennessy whiskey in this, I guess, I don't know. I thought it was more of a cordial drink. Drouet just pours like a half a finger's worth and then takes the bottle of seltzer. I mean, he is the manager. He can help himself. Takes the seltzer bottle and just spritzes seltzer in his Hennessy snifter, which seems sacrilegious to me. "What's become of Crayot?" remarked Hertzwood. I haven't seen him around here in 2 weeks. Laid up, they say, explained Drouet. Say he's a gouty old boy. Made a lot of money in his time, though, hasn't he? Yes, wads of it, returned Drouet. He won't live much longer, barely comes down to the office now. Just one boy, hasn't he? Asked Hertzwood. Yes, a swift pacer, laughed Drouet. I guess he can't hurt the business very much, though, with the other members in there. No, he can't injure that in any way, I guess. Hertzwood was standing, his coat open, his thumbs in his pockets, the light on his jewels and rings relieving them with agreeable distinctness. He was the picture of fastidious comfort. Hello, George, said a voice, and Hertzwood turned around to put his hand in that of another worldly represent in dress, another worthy. Here's a good word. Brian looks up words. Resplendent, yeah. Put his hand in that of another worthy resplendent in dress and feature who had arrived from some other part of the country. They now conversed together in the same politeness phraseology, while Drouet drew out his purse to get a bill. Again, 1889, a wallet is called a purse because it's larger. Purses were, everybody used them because, again, 1889, because by our standards, money is deflated then. Most people are carrying coins. You need something bigger. A mail purse back then is about the size of this book. It's more of a billfold. It's like a small thing. There's no Ridge wallets. There's no credit cards. So Drouet is getting out his wallet to get the bill, and the bartender saw his action and signaled with his hands. It's on the manager, he said, smiling merrily. Hertzwood had them so trained that they knew. Let me introduce you to my friend here, Hertzwood said, coming up, and he unloaded the newcomer on Drouet, which shook hands and immediately inquired if he would have something. Together they conversed as at first three-handed, which with Hertzwood, then alone, while the latter went to his little office to talk with two fat, rosy-cheeked gentlemen who were there waiting to see him. Drouet could see that it was both genial and interesting meeting, for they talked with their heads together, they leaned back and laughed and talked again and so on, while they exchanged commonplaces. So they're having a delightful, comfortable evening in the presence of merry men, drinking fine drinks in a warm establishment, and, talking about absolutely nothing. What are you doing tonight? Said the newcomer after a time. Oh, I think I'll go over to the Grand Inn a little while, returned Drouet. What's there? Hoyote's a hole in the ground. Well, if I haven't seen that several times, I'd join you, he remarked with a spirit of ready companionship which seems to be characteristic of the thoughtless. God damn, that's a sentence. Remarked with the spirit of ready companionship which seems to be characteristic of the thoughtless. These are just dumb guys who happen to have money. They're just do-ka-do-ka-do. Just then a third individual appeared who knew the second and took him away, leaving Drouet to gaze, smoke, and breathe with smiling satisfaction in the, to him, delightful atmosphere prevailing. God, that's good. So he talks like Hertzwood so far has been the only significant person Drouet has talked to all night, the manager of the club. So then he talks to these two other NPCs, and they just talk about, as we would say today, talk about the weather. And then they go away, and Drouet's alone at the bar with his cigar, with his Hennessy, big ass smile on his face. He's like, I did good human talk, I did. I talk with people now. Drink. I wish Fred were here. He'd love this book. I'll read this on his stream. It seems like a live stream practice for you improving your writing, which was already very good. I'm thrilled to keep watching this. Do you recommend any of your good writing exercises? Not this moment. Jonathan Cannon doesn't have any questions, but thank you for the donation. To one not inclined to drink and gifted with a more serious turn of mind, such a babbling, chattering, glimmering chamber must ever seem an anomaly, a strange commentary on nature and life. Here come the moths in endless procession to bask in the light of the flame. Such conversation as one may hear would not warrant a commendation on the scene upon intellectual grounds. It seems plain that schemers would choose a more sequestered quarters to arrange their plans. That politicians would not gather here in company to discuss anything save formalities where the sharp ear may hear. And it would scarcely be justified on the score of thirst, for the majority of those who frequented these more gorgeous places have no craving for liquor. Nevertheless, the fact that here men gather, here chatter, here love to pass and rub elbows must be explained upon some grounds. It must be that strange bundle of passions and vague desires gives rise to such a curious social institution, or it would not be. Drouet, for one, was lured as much by his longing for pleasure as by his desire to shine among his betters. The many friends he met here dropped in because they craved, without perhaps consciously analyzing it, the company, the glow, the atmosphere which they found. One might take it after all as an augur of the better social order, for these things which they satisfied here through sensory were not evil. No evil could come out of the contemplation of an expensively decorated chamber. The worst effects such thing could have would be perhaps to stir up in the material-minded an ambition to arrange their lives upon a similarly splendid basis. In the last analysis, that would be scarcely be called the fault of the decorations, but rather of the innate trend of the mind. That such a scene might stir the less expensively dressed to emulate the more expensively dressed could be scarcely laid at the door as anything save the false ambition of the minds of those so affected. Remove the element so thoroughly and so solely complained of, liquor, and there would not be one to gainsay the qualities of beauty and enthusiasm which would remain. The pleased eye with which our modern restaurant of fashion are looked upon is proof positive of this assertion. So this very long sentence right here is Theodore Dreiser saying, okay, so why are these people coming here to talk about nothing? Is it the place? This place is comfortable, but fancy decorations can do so much. And most of the people talking here aren't drinking to get drunk, so why are they drinking at all? And anybody who's up to no good, or any politicians coming here, would not really talk about anything serious because the place is so big and there's so many people here, someone would overhear you. So what is it about these fancy, expensive places that everybody wants to come here? There was a very good interview, and I forget the owner of, and this is a quote that's been reused from time to time. One of the owners or managers of Studio 54 during the 70s in New York City admitted, look, we've got the same drinks as everybody else, the same music as everybody else. We have the same square footage as everybody else. So you have to find something else to distinguish yourself in the restaurant business or the hospitality business or the entertainment business. You have to create some sort of magic that makes people want to come here. Yet here is the fact of the lighted chamber, the dressy, greedy company, the small, self-interested plavier, the disorganized, aimless, wandering mental action which it represents, the love of light and show and finery which, to one outside under the serene light of the eternal stars, must seem a strange and shiny thing. Under the stars and sweeping night winds, what a lamp flower it must bloom. A strange, glittering night flower, odor-yielding, insect-drawing, insect-infested rose of pleasure. So there's something about this nightclub in Chicago in 1889 that just shines so brightly. People want to come here. See that fellow coming in there? said Hertzwood, returning and glancing at a gentleman entering, arrayed in a high hat and a Prince Albert coat. Very different use of the term Prince Albert. His fat cheeks puffed red as with good eating. No, where? Said Drouet. There, said Hertzwood, indicating the direction by a cast of his eye. The man in the silk hat. Oh, yes, said Drouet, now affecting not to see. Who is he? That's Julius Wallace, the spiritualist. Drouet followed him with his eyes, much interested. Doesn't look like much of a man who sees spirits, does he? Said Drouet. Oh, I don't know, returned Hertzwood. He's got the money all right. And a little twinkle passed over his eyes. I don't go much on those things, do you? Asked Drouet. Well, you never can tell, said Hertzwood. There may be something to it. I wouldn't bother about it myself, though. By the way, he added, you going anywhere tonight? A hole in the ground, said Drouet, mentioning about the popular farce at the time. Farce would be, farce is a comedy. So he's going to the theater to watch a comedic play. Well, you better get going. It's 8:30 already, and he drew out his watch. The crowd was already thinning out considerably, some bound for the theaters, some to the clubs, and some to that most fascinating of all the pleasures, for the type of man there represented at least the ladies, which means men going out to bust in some strange. Yes, I will, said Drouet. Come around after the show. I have something I want to show you, said Hertzwood. Sure, said Drouet, elated. You haven't had anything on hand for the night, have you? Added Hertzwood. Not a thing. Well, come around then. Is she a blonde? Said Drouet, laughing. Come around after 12, said Hertzwood, ignoring the question. I struck a little peach coming in on the train on Friday, remarked Drouet, in the way of parting. By George, that's so. I must go and call on her place before I go away. Oh, never mind her, Hertzwood remarked. I say she was a little dandy, I tell you, went on Drouet, confidently trying to impress his friend. 12 o'clock, said Hertzwood. That's right, Drouet said, going out. Thus was Carrie's name branded about in the most frivolous and gay of places. And that was also when the little toiler was bemoaning her narrow lot, which was almost inseparable from the early stages of this, her unfolding fate. So as we hung out with Drouet and Hertzwood at the fabulous Hannah and Hogg's Resort, which is really, it's not a nightclub, but I think it's even more than that. Day, nightclub. If you like John Wick, think of Hannah and Hogg's as the Continental. We're always open. The menu here exquisite. The bar unparalleled. That's the type of place this is, minus the murder. So while this is all happening, these people going out to the theaters, having a drink. Of course, there's food here. There's money coming in at the same time. The previous chapter of this book was contrasted with Carrie toiling away all day for $5.50 a week. Check on the stream here. Another night with this dozer of a book. What era of time does this take place in? Yeah, 1889. This is the current year. This book, which is a 500-page book, which we will get through eventually, spans a number of years. Chapter 6. At the flat that evening, Carrie felt a new phase of its atmosphere. The face that it was unchanged while her feelings were different. Increased her knowledge of its character. Minnie, after the good spirits Carrie manifested at the time of securing the place, expected, of course, a fair report. Hanson supposed that Carrie would be satisfied. Well, he said, as he came in from the hall in his working clothes and looked at Carrie through the dining room door. How did you make out? Oh, said Carrie. It's pretty hard. I don't like it. There was an air about her which showed plainer than any words that she was both weary and disappointed. What sort of work is it? He asked, lingering a moment as he turned upon his heel to go into the bathroom. Running a machine, answered Carrie. It was very evident that it did not concern him much save from the side of the flat success. He was irritated a shade because it could not have come about in the throw of fortune for Carrie to be pleased. Minnie worked with less elation than she had just before Carrie arrived. The sizzle of meat frying did not sound quite so pleasing now that Carrie had reported her discontent. To Carrie, the one relief of the whole day would have been a jolly home, a sympathetic reception, a bright supper table, and someone to say, "Oh, well, stand it a little while, you'll get something better." But now this was ashes. She began to see that they looked upon her complaint as unwarranted, and that she was supposed to work on and say nothing. She knew that she was to pay $4 from her for her board and room, and now she felt that it would be an exceedingly gloomy round, living with these people. Minnie was no companion for her sister. She was too old. Interestingly, call her too old. She's in her mid-20s and Carrie's 18. Her thoughts were stayed and solemnly accepted to a condition. Hanson, if he had any pleasant thoughts or happy feelings, concealed them. He seemed to do all his mental operations without the aid of physical expression. He was as still as a deserted chamber. So this is what Carrie's thinking about. She's working in this factory job and it sucks. And what does she have to come home to? Her older sister, who doesn't say much, and her husband, who just sits in a chair and does nothing. Silence in the apartment. Of course, there's a little baby running around too. Otto Suffer did enjoy his recommendation on watching Le Grand Illusion. Excellent. Lifespans were different. I assume the difference must felt larger in her perspective. Yeah, that's true. Carrie, on the other hand, had the blood of youth and some imagination. Her days of love and the mysteries of courtship were still ahead. She could think of things she would like to do, of clothes she would like to wear, and of places she would like to visit. These were the things which her mind ran upon, and it was like meeting with opposition at every turn to find no one here to call forth or respond to her feelings. Today we would call that no one's validating her. She had forgotten, in considering and explaining the result of her day, that Drouet might come. Now that she saw how unreceptive these two people were, she hoped he would not. She did not know exactly what she would do or how she would explain Drouet if he did come, and yet her fear of his arrival after her letter was not great enough to cause her to attempt to clear the way beforehand in any case of accident. For want of the suitable conversation, she thought this over, and after supper changed her clothes. When she was ready, she was rather a sweet little being with large eyes and a sad mouth. Her face expressed the mingled acceptancy, dissatisfaction, and desperation she felt, but not as distinctly as she would have been in the case of a more refined. She would have been in case more refined mortals. She wandered about after the dishes were put away, talked a little with Minnie, and then, struck by a bright idea, decided to go down and stand in the door at the foot of the stairs. There was the way out of this difficulty if Drouet came. She could meet him there. Her face took on the semblance of a look of happiness, and she put on her hat to go below. So the whole thing was, if Drouet came by, how would she explain him? And of course, morals were different then in 1889. Who's this guy? We don't know who this guy is. You didn't tell us about him. So Minnie and Hanson seemed to be very close-minded individuals, and how would they explain this fancy-dressed man just showing up? So instead of her up on the third floor apartment, she's going to walk down the stairs and stand by the front door of the apartment. Carrie doesn't seem to like her place very well, says Minnie to her husband when the latter came out, paper in hand, to sit in the dining room for a few minutes. She ought to keep it up for a time anyhow, said Hanson. Has she gone downstairs? Yes, said Millie. I'd tell her to keep it if I were you. She might be here weeks without getting another one. Minnie said she would, and Hanson read his paper a while. If I were you, he said a little later, I wouldn't let her stand in the door down there. It doesn't look good. I'll tell her, said Minnie. Now what Hanson means by that, doesn't look good for her standing down in the door. Or prostitutes back then wouldn't really walk the streets. They would just sort of stand in doorways. So that's what Hanson is worried about, making the place look like it was a whorehouse. Meanwhile, Carrie was in the door below, looking at the lights in the stores about, the people passing and the streetcars, jingling merry past toward the heart of the city or out toward the suburbs, directions which to her were interesting mysteries. She enjoyed looking at the boys playing tag about the street and the young girls who went by in companies laughing and talking. Once in a while she would see a young girl particularly well-dressed or particularly pretty, or both, which excited her envy and enhanced her longing for nice clothes. Once in a while a dapper young fellow in his best suit would stride lightly past, bound, she was sure, to call upon some young lady. There were other youths, not so well dressed, who came in pairs or groups, ogling her, pushing one another and cutting up in such a way as to attract attention. These she gave an assumed look of coldness, or turned her gaze away entirely, which did not, however, seem to faze the young gentleman in question. They would laugh, whistle, perhaps shout a little, and look back still hopeful, but without daring to attempt a more intimate overtone. The kind of young men whose faint hearts are concealed behind a show of boisterous enthusiasm. Essentially bros. Once in a while, a figure in the distance would look as if it might be that of Drouet, and then she would straighten up and become terse in nerves until, with a nearer approach, her whole flutter and strain would collapse in the face of certain outlines which would prove that the scent was false. The sprinkling of pedestrians continued for a long time to interest Carrie. She never wearied of wondering where the people in the cars were going or what the enjoyments were which they had. Her imagination trod in a very narrow round, always winding up at points which concerned money, looks, clothes, or enjoyment. She would have a far-off thought of Columbia City now, which is her home, and then, or in an interesting rush of feeling concerning the experiences of the present day. But on the whole, the little world around her enlisted her whole attention. The first floor of the building, of which Hanson's flat was occupied by a bakery, and to this, while she was standing there, Hanson came down to buy a loaf of bread. She was not aware of his presence until he was quite near. "I'm after bread," was all he said as he passed. The contagion of thought here demonstrated itself. While Hanson really came for bread, the thought dwelt with him that he would see what Carrie was doing. No sooner did he draw near with her with that in mind than she felt it. Of course, she had no understanding of what put that into her head, but nevertheless, it aroused in her the first shade of real antipathy to him. She knew now that she did not like him. He was suspicious. So, Hanson didn't like Carrie for standing in the doorway looking like a whore. And Carrie knew that Hanson didn't like her, so she's just going to not like him now. This is probably going to be our last chapter, and then we'll wrap it up for bed. A thought will color a world for us. The flow of Carrie's meditations had been disturbed, and Hanson had not long gone upstairs before she followed. She had realized with the lapse of the quarter hours that Drouet was not coming, and somehow she felt a little resentful. A little as if she had been forsaken, was not good enough. She went upstairs, where everything was silent. Minnie was sewing by a lamp at the table. Hanson had already turned in for the night. In her weariness and disappointment, Carrie did no more than announce that she was going to bed. "Yes, you better," returned Minnie. "You've got to get up early, you know." The morning was no better. Hanson was just going out the door as Carrie came out of her room. Minnie tried to talk with her during breakfast, but there was not much interest which they could mutually discuss. As on the previous morning, Carrie walked downtown, for she began to realize now that her $4.50 would not even allow her car fare after she paid her board. This seemed a miserable arrangement. But the morning light swept away the first misgivings of the day, as the morning light is ever wont to do. At the shoe factory, she put in a long day, scarcely so wearisome as the preceding, but considerably less novel. The foreman of the room was of Irish extraction, an individual who ruled with a mix of brood and frowns, sharp looks and unbending language. Besides him, there was a thorough Irishman who wore exceedingly squeaky shoes, who was all over the floors as head foreman. Carrie made his acquaintance by his own introduction. Where did you come from? He inquired this morning, stopping for the first time beside his machine. Mr. Brown hired me, she replied. Oh, he did, eh? And then, see that you keep things going. The machine girls impressed her even less favorably. They seemed satisfied with their lot and, in a sense, common. Carrie had more imagination than they. She was not used to their slang. Her instinct in the manner of dress was naturally better. She felt bad to have to listen to the girl next to her, who was slangy and rather hardened by experience. I'm going to quit this, she heard her remark to her neighbor. What with the stipend and being up late, it's too much for me health. They were free with the fellows, young and old, about the place, and exchanged banter and rude phrases which at first shocked her. She saw that she was taken to be of the same sort and addressed accordingly. Hello, remarked one of the stout ritual soul workers to her at noon. You're a daisy. He really expected her to be the common, oh, go chase yourself. In return, she was sufficiently abashed by Carrie's silent moving away to retreat, awkwardly grinning. That night at the flat, she was even more lonely. The dull situation was becoming harder to endure. She could see that the Hansons seldom or never had any company. Standing at the street door looking out, she ventured to walk out a little way. Her easy gait and idle manner attracted the attention of an offensive but common sort. She was slightly taken aback at the overtones of a well-dressed man of 30 who, in passing, looked at her, reduced his pace, turned back, and said, Out for a little stroll, are you, this evening? Carrie looked at him in amazement and then summoned sufficient thought to reply, Why, I don't know you, backing away as she did so. That doesn't matter, said the other affably. She bandied no more words with him, but hurried away, reaching her own door quite out of breath. There was something in the man's look which frightened her. During the remainder of the week, it was very much the same. One of the 2 nights she found herself too tired to walk home and expended cab fare. She was not very strong, and sitting all day affected her back. She went to bed one night before Hanson. Transplantation is not always successful in the matter of flowers or maidens. It requires sometimes a richer soil or a better atmosphere to continue even a natural growth. It would have been better if her acclimatization had been more gradual, less rigid. She would have done better if she had not secured a position so quickly and had seen more of the city which she constantly troubled to know about. On the first morning it rained. She found that she had no umbrella. Minnie loaned her one of hers, which was anything but handsome. These were the kind of there was the kind of vanity in Carrie that troubled at this. She went on to one of the great department stores and bought one herself, using $1.25 of her small store to pay for it. What did you do that for? Said Carrie, asked Minnie when she saw it. Oh, I needed one, said Carrie. You foolish girl, went on Minnie. Carrie resented this, though she did not reply. She was not going to be a common shop girl, she thought. They did not to think it either. Another thing that was irritating was the stay-at-home idishness of the Hansons. They would not go anywhere at night, and all day Carrie could not. In the factory she had heard girls talking of many amusements, things which her heart was longing to see. For instance, at the noon half-hour, 4 girls in one of the windows were listening to a story by one of their number about how she had visited the Criterion. There was a farce there called The 8 Bells. Oh, it was so funny, exclaimed the realtor, meaning the person telling the story. There was one little fat man who was just great. They have a mule which they pull apart and do the strangest things. Carrie listened to this with ready ears. Why couldn't she go see that too? Gee, I'm so tired, yawned one pretty girl one morning. I danced till 2 o'clock last night. At first, Carrie was inclined to look upon these things with misgivings, but in proportion as her own lot impressed her as pointless and difficult, these things took on the hue of withheld delights. She did not crave exactly to dance at the bells of the plantiners or the woodworkers' unions, but when she heard of outings in the parks or on the lake, visits to the theaters, flirtations with young men, and so on, she felt her own life to be exceedingly narrow. She wished she could do something that would give her more money, if only she could get work in the fair. On the first Saturday night, Carrie paid her board, $4, which Minnie had mentioned in the latter home. She paid her board $4, which Minnie had mentioned in the letter home she would keep her for. Minnie had a quiver of conscience as she took it, but she did not know how to explain to Hanson if she took less. That worthy give-up of just $4 less toward the household expenses was a smile of satisfaction. He contemplated increasing his building and loan payments. As for Carrie, she studied over the problem of finding clothes and amusements on 50 cents a week with considerable vigor. She brooded over the thing until she was in a state of mental rebellion. "I'm going up the street for a walk," she said after supper. "Not alone, are you?" asked Hanson. "Yes," returned Carrie. "I wouldn't," said Minnie. "I want to see something," said Carrie, and by the tone she put into the last word, they realized for the first time that she was not wholly pleased. "What's the matter with her?" asked Hanson when she went into the front room to get her hat. "I don't know," said Minnie. "Well, she ought to know better than to want to go out alone." Carrie did not go very far at all. She returned and stood in the door. The next day they went out to Garfield Park, but it did not please her. She did not look well enough. In the shop the next day she heard the highly colored reports in which the girls gave their trivial amusements. They had been happy. On several days it rained and she used up her cab fare. One night she got thoroughly soaked going to catch a car at Van Buren Street. All that evening she sat alone in the front room looking out upon the street, where the lights were reflected on the wet pavements, thinking. She had imagination enough to be moody. On Saturday, she paid another $4 and pocketed her 50 cents in despair. The speaking acquaintanceship which she formed with some of the girls at the shop discovered to her the fact that they had more of their earnings to use for themselves than she did. They had young men of the kind whom she, since her experience with Drouet, felt above, who took them out. She came to thoroughly dislike the light-hearted young fellows of the shop. None of them had a show of refinement. She saw only their workday side. There came a day when the first premonitory, that's a good word, blast of winter swept over the city. Uh-oh. It's getting near winter in Chicago. It scuttled the fleecy clouds in the heavens, trailed along thin streamers of smoke from the tall stacks, and raced about the streets and the corners in sharp with sudden puffs. Carrie now felt the problem of winter clothes. What was she to do? She had no winter jacket, no hat, no shoes. She thought some about asking Minnie to let her keep the money and buy those things. She would need to work a whole month before she would have enough to do anything with. Once she resolved to ask Minnie, but every time it came to the point of doing so, she lacked the courage to bring it up. The increasingly cool mornings constantly reminded her. At last she summoned up the courage. "I don't know what I'm going to do about clothes," she said one evening when she and Minnie were together. "I need a hat." Minnie looked serious. "Why don't you keep part of your money and buy yourself one?" she suggested, worrying over the situation worried over the situation which the withholding of Carrie's money would create. "I'd like to do it for a week if you don't mind," she ventured Carrie. "Well, could you pay $2? asked Minnie. Carrie readily acquiesced, glad to escape the trying situation and liberal now that she saw a way out. She was elated and began figuring at once. She needed a hat, first of all. How Minnie explained to Hanson she never knew. He said nothing at all. But there were thoughts in the air which left disagreeable impressions. The new arrangement might have worked if sickness had not intervened. It blew up a cold after a rain one afternoon when Carrie was still without a jacket. She came out of the warm shop at 6 and shivered as the wind struck her. In the morning she was sneezing, and going downtown made it worse. That day her bones ached and she felt lightheaded. Toward evening she felt very ill, and when she reached home she was not hungry. Minnie noticed her drooping action and asked about herself. "I don't know, said Carrie. "I feel really bad." She hung about the stove, suffered a chattering chill, and went to bed sick. The next morning she was thoroughly feverish. Minnie was truly distressed at this, but maintained a kindly demeanor. Hanson said perhaps she better go back home for a while. When she got up after 3 days, it was taken for granted that her position was lost. The winter was near at hand, she had no clothes, and now she was out of work. "I don't know," said Carrie. "I'll go down Monday and see if I can't get something." If anything, her efforts were poorly rewarded on this trial than the last. Her clothes were nothing suitable for the fall wearing. Her last money she had spent for the hat. For 3 days she wandered about utterly dispirited. The attitude of the flat was fast becoming unbearable. She hated to think of going back there each evening. Hanson was so cold. She knew it could not last much longer. Shortly she should have to give up and go back home. On the 4th day she was downtown all day, having borrowed 10 cents for lunch from Minnie. She had applied in the cheapest kinds of places without success. She even answered a call for a waitress in a small restaurant where she saw a card in the window, but they wanted an experienced girl. She moved through the thick throng of strangers, utterly subdued in spirit. Suddenly, a hand pulled her arm and turned her about. "Well, well," said a voice. In the first glance she beheld Drouet. That worthy was not only rosy-cheeked, but radiant. He was the essence of sunshine and good humor. "Why, how are you, Carrie?" he said. "You're a daisy. Where have you been?" Carrie smiled under his irresistible flood of generality. So Carrie finally meets Drouet after all this time. So the tea gets hotter, the plot thickens. Wait, did she quit? No, she just assumed she was fired after not showing up for work for 3 days. What time is it? Oh, it's after midnight. Well, this is a good place to stop. So Carrie, after tons of misery, after deciding she kind of didn't like Drouet, after kind of how he was creepy on the train coming into Chicago, suddenly he doesn't seem so bad after all this hardship she's been through. Sick, no winter clothes, no nothing, but now she ran into Drouet on the streets. So That's the end of our story tonight. Thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the 28 people who are enjoying this. Wouldn't be a stream if we didn't end this with the weather. So currently at Arciera Central, it is 37 degrees. The high today was 41, the low 37. The National Weather Service has issued a winter weather advisory for the county. Sunrise was at 7:21 a.m. Sunset was at 4:38 p.m. Chance of rain currently is still 40%. Humidity 93%. Winds east-northeast at 11 miles an hour. Wind chill 28 degrees. Precipitation currently is 0.9 inches. Pressure 29.81 inches of mercury. Visibility 6 miles. UV index 0. Tomorrow, Saturday, will be sunny with a high of 36 degrees and a low of 25. Sunday, partly sunny, high 34, low 25. And on Monday, partly sunny, a high of 36 degrees and a low of 25. Thank you for listening. Good night.